Hello, if you don't know me, I am Marika. I'm the Executive Director of the Cambridge Historical Society, and it's such a pleasure to see everybody. Quick show of hands, how many people are members? Hooray! I love that. Good news for anyone who is not a member, you can join tonight and be part of our wonderful group. And we, of course, welcome everyone here. We are one of the most revolutionary historical societies in the country, so who wouldn't want to be a part of that? So welcome. As a reminder, as a private nonprofit receiving no operating support from the city or state, we rely on your generosity to create events like this that you won't get anywhere else. If you find value in tonight's program, I hope you'll consider supporting our work. So I'm so pleased to see all of you here tonight, familiar faces and a few new ones, as we kick off another year of programming. Throughout 2018, we are asking, where is Cambridge from? As you recall, beginning 2 years ago, we decided to tackle issues that Cambridge is facing today and offer a historical perspective. We vowed to be timely, to be relevant, and to be students of curiosity and inquiry. We want to help Cambridge think like historians, and I think that we have more than succeeded. In 2016, we raised issues of housing and who gets to call Cambridge home. Last year, we talked about what Cambridge makes and how it has influenced our jobs, our physical landscape, and our way of life over the years. Another show of hands, how many people have attended one or more of our programs in the last 2 years? Excellent, look at that. Did you enjoy them? Just a smile, a shout, a huzzah. Yeah, excellent, thank you. We take great effort and pride in all the programs that we put together. First, we choose a theme for the year. Then, in consultation with our programs committee, our staff set to work finding just the right speakers, just the right venue, and just the right tone to craft a perfect event. Great care goes into this work. I'd like to acknowledge now the programs committee. Can members of the committee raise their hands? Hooray, thank you. Applause, off mic. Yes, thank you for giving so generously of your time. Of course, it's the hard work of all of our committees that makes us successful. So I would love to see a show of hands of any committee member from the society, board members, committee members, show of hands. Yes, hello, thank you. Tireless work and amazing contributions to your community through volunteering. So where is Cambridge from? No doubt you have a reaction when you hear this question. Is this year about immigration versus nativism, belonging, taxpayers versus students, first-generation Cantabrigians versus third generation? By design, it's a complicated question and one with many interpretations. For me, it's a question of identity. I've been thinking of this a lot recently because I just made a Cantabrigian. She is 13 weeks old and is hopefully having an easy evening at home with her dad, unaware that mom has been gone for a couple of hours. 90% of her life has been spent in Cambridge. She was born at Mount Auburn Hospital. She lives in Huron Village. She goes to the doctor across the street here, and she's traveled to Boston exactly twice. She even marched for women's rights a couple weeks ago on the Cambridge Common with a sign that read, "Our future is female." Kurt and I joked before she was born, how did we end up with a Cantabrigian? Neither of us are from here, and neither thought we would end up here, yet we made a New Englander. If she leaves the area, will she call herself a Cantabrigian? Is she indeed from here? I imagine all of us have a version of this story. We were either born here, came here deliberately, or just ended up here. I've heard a lot of these stories as we've talked about this year's theme, and all the stories are great. School brought us here, or love, or chance. In any case, here we are making Cambridge our home. But how does this ragtag group of diverse individuals from different places make a community? This year, we're going to explore this question and more through our award-winning programming. Tonight, we kick off 2018 with our opening conversation to help us frame this year's theme. History Cafes, the program I describe as lectures and bars, although so much more, will once again challenge your assumptions about this city, as will our fall symposium, award-winning. While all of our events have elements of fun, our spring benefit in April will be all fun, so mark your calendars now. Our goal here at the Society is to raise questions about this city today and use history to help answer them. No one else in Cambridge does that quite like we do. I hope that you will join us for all of our events this year as you are able. I like to think of our years as continuing education courses. Sure, you can drop in for a class here and there, but coming to all of them gives you the richest education. I hope you'll all strive for perfect attendance, ending the year not with all questions answered, but with a more open mind, a deeper understanding, and renewed empathy. With that in mind, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to remember your answer. Tell the person next to you, write it down, or just keep it in your mind. I want you to remember your answer because I'm going to ask you the question again at the end of the year, and I'll be interested to know how your answer has changed after you've participated in some programs. Here's my question. When you walk down Mass Ave or Mem Drive or Main Street, whatever is your Cambridge, what makes you feel like you belong in this city? Is it the people you meet, the buildings you recognize, the businesses you frequent? What is it? What makes you feel like you belong? Thank you again for coming tonight and for joining us on this year's adventure. Again, I hope that if you value what you learned tonight and all year long, you'll consider supporting us with a gift, or perhaps joining us on a committee. We're super fun. You belong here and you are welcome here. The history of Cambridge is incomplete without you. Before we begin, a bit of housekeeping. This opening conversation will be followed by our brief annual business meeting. After the question and answer period, we will shift gears and attend to some society business as required by our bylaws. You'll hear some committee updates. We'll then propose a slate of officers and elect new council members, and we'll explain with your vote how we will adopt some minor changes to our bylaws. We'd ask you please linger in the auditorium afterwards for a quick group photo. Doesn't that sound great? You're gonna love it. It's so great to see all your beautiful faces captured here tonight in this moment where we're all here together. And then, of course, we're going to enjoy some more beautiful light refreshments courtesy of Capital One Cafe and Jules Catering. I would now like to introduce Diana Lempel. Diana, who hopefully you already know, needs no introduction, but she's an interviewer, a facilitator, a historian, and a writer. She's pursuing her PhD in the Department of Architecture, Landscape Architecture, and Urban Planning at Harvard. She's the co-founder and co-principal of Practice Space, a storefront studio for art, design, and research in Inman. Who has been? It's a glorious space. Please stop by at your next opportunity. She's also the Doing History Curator at the Society. She grew up in Northern California, but she calls Cambridge and a historic house her home. Welcome, Diana, and welcome to the rest of our speakers.
Okay, thank you. So glad to see you all. I'm going to start with some show of hand questions before I introduce our speakers tonight and get our conversation going. So I would like for you to raise your hand if you live in Cambridge. Have you lived in Cambridge for more than a year? Raise your hand. If you've lived in Cambridge, and this is not just for me, this is for all of us to see. So take a look around the room as the hands go up. Have you lived in Cambridge for more than 5 years? Have you lived in Cambridge for more than 20 years? Whoa! Have you lived in Cambridge for more than 30 years? Wow, that's amazing. That's so cool. Oh gosh, okay, I don't even have beyond 30 years. Have you lived in Cambridge for more than 50 years? Sweet, 68, amazing. Okay, so now we're gonna break it down in a different way. If you live in Cambridge, raise your hand if you were born here. Raise your hand if you came here sometime between your birth and your 18th birthday, so as a kid. How many of you came here between 18 and, I'm gonna change this a little bit. How many of you came here between 18 and 22 as college students? How many of you came here between 22 and 35? Okay, so interesting. How many of you came here after 35? Cool. Raise your hand if you work in Cambridge. Okay, and here's the punchline question. How many of you would say you're from Cambridge? Okay, thanks everyone. I think we should do that again too at some point during the year because I liked seeing this. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our speakers and then get our conversation started. So Alexandra Sedlovskaya is an assistant director, she's here in the middle here, is assistant director at the C. Roland Christensen Center for Teaching and Learning at Harvard Business School, and she's instructor at Harvard Extension School. She obtained her PhD in social psychology from Yale University. Her research focuses on issues around social identity, diversity and inclusion, and pedagogical approaches that support participant-centered learning. And she's going to be really important for us tonight to help frame the ideas that we're going to be talking about all year. Kerri Greenidge currently teaches history, yes, here, currently teaches history at Tufts University through the Consortium of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora Studies. She is also co-director of Tufts African American Freedom Trail Project through the University Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. And you can see a visual of that project outside, get a sense of what that entails. It's a Greater Boston project, which I didn't realize. It's really cool. Yeah, it's neat. Kerri received her doctorate in American Studies from Boston University and previously worked as a historian for the Boston African American National Historical Site. That's different. Her forthcoming book is a biography of African American activist William Monroe Trotter, which explores the history of racial thought and African American political radicalism in New England at the turn of the 20th century. Okay, so I wanted to get started by asking each of you a question for you to answer, to introduce yourselves to us so that we can get to know both you and your work. And then we'll move on to the conversation. And before I do that, I just wanted to mention that here we have two thinkers who've been really immersed in the topic for a year from very different disciplinary places. And so talking across disciplines is important, and it's beautiful, and it's also challenging because sometimes even words that think you mean what they mean something different to the other person. So we're gonna work across this disciplinary, not boundary, this disciplinary, what is it? Approach, yeah. We're gonna work across our different disciplinary approaches and hopefully learn from each other, and we're gonna see some real genuine curiosity between you two, which I'm really excited about. So, okay, here we go. I wanted to start by asking for each of you to tell us a little bit about how your personal story led you to study what it is that you study and to care about what it is that you care about in your work. And if it doesn't come naturally, to also just tell us a little bit about why you're here, what interested you about this event tonight. Okay.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was such an amazing event to attend and be part of it. And I was very pleased when you reached out to me. So a little bit about me. Actually, first I want to say it's quite impressive how many hands gone up when people said that they are from Cambridge and how long you actually spent here. It's remarkable. And for me, I honestly have to pause and think when people ask me where I'm from. And for me, a lot of time the answer depends on the context in which I'm asked. Sometimes I would say where I live, and sometimes I would say where I'm from, and they're not always the same. And in fact, I think it's a very timely question too, because in the course that I'm teaching, which is on self and identity, we'll be talking about self-knowledge this week. And one of the motivators often for people to set on the path of self-discovery is moving. And for me, again, it could be moving across the world, it could be moving across the country, it could be moving to different neighborhoods. It's quite remarkable the cultural differences you might observe just by changing zip codes. And I have to say that I think my journey had started when I moved from Russia to the United States. Really highlighted the impact that the surroundings may have on us. And I don't necessarily mean schools or people you live with, but even the more subtle, and especially the more subtle cues that you don't really recognize that impact how you behave until you step outside of that. And I think that's why they're so powerful, because you don't often recognize them. And so I started thinking about how our environment really shapes us in a way that we might not even be aware of, and the dynamic nature of our identities. And then in relation to that, how then we interact with the world and shape it. And then I realized it's not just having a single identity. I'm not just from Russia, right? I'm academic, I'm a researcher. So it's really, how do we interact with our identities? What does it mean to us? For example, being from Russia, and even, I don't know how much you know about the history of it, but for example, being Jewish or being gay in Russia, it's not longer being Russian, it's really being Russian Jew. And it's such a different interaction when you think about what does it mean to be from Russia for somebody with different identities, especially if you have to conceal it, or if you know that an identity that's important to you is also devalued in the setting that's important to you. And so that's what led me to research around self and identities, and how do we navigate and manage multiple identities, and how we interact with the world through this integrated view of the self. So hopefully we'll talk more about those aspects, but let me pass it to you now.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be on the panel. Nice to talk to the crowd. So, where I'm from, I am not originally born in Cambridge, but my family.
I just want to step in to say I didn't ask where you're from. You didn't answer that question. Yes, exactly. But in terms of where I'm from and how that relates to my work, I think is relevant. So I think all history is personal. Historians don't ever approach something just because they approach it. They approach it because it's biography. So my father's family arrived in Cambridge in the 19-teens and purchased property on Magazine Street in the 1920s and became the first homeowners to rent property to West Indians who migrated here from the Caribbean. And during the 1920s and 1930s. And so his family, that side of my family has been in Cambridge since the 19-teens. My mother's side of the family was one of the first black families to buy a property in Arlington in the 1950s, and purchased 3 properties in Arlington Heights and rented them out to black families in Arlington in the 1950s. So I'm very local in that respect. My grandmother, my maternal grandparents were from Providence, Rhode Island. They moved up there at the end of the Civil War and taught at Dartmouth. My great-grandfather was one of the first black professors, adjunct professors. Black people couldn't become professors at the time, teaching Shakespearean studies at Dartmouth. So in terms of my own work in terms of history, I found that growing up and being very local and going to schools in Cambridge, even though I didn't live in Cambridge, was that I didn't see a lot of reflections of my family story anywhere. And it was even difficult when I went to college, at a very progressive, very good college, to get the sort of historical context for the stories that I knew to be true. And so that's really what drove me into becoming a historian. I took a lot of time off after my undergraduate sort of foray, and I worked for the National Park Service because I thought that was a way to kind of get at the stories that I had seen, and the stories that I had seen told by the African American people I grew up around in New England, that I didn't see in the literature. And so that then made me go back to graduate school and try to figure out how I can then approach it from a scholarly perspective, but then how you can then bring that to the general public and create a broader knowledge of what blackness means, of what political history means, of what New England history means, and use that from a historical perspective. So that's what brought me here. And in terms of being here, I'm really interested in how it is that all of these local historical sites that New England is really good at, and all of you are a testament to that, how they can connect to each other in terms of the stories that they tell, particularly in terms of African American stories, but just stories generally. And so that's part of sort of why I'm here in my perspective.
Yes. I really didn't answer the question. I'm here. Yes. So it's already, I think, alluded a little bit that I'm really interested in understanding how our social environments, our immediate social environments, and what do we mean by our immediate social environments, right? How immediate are they? How they shape who we are, and then how do we also shape the environment around us? So when we talked about Cambridge, and of course we're gonna take it from different perspective, and I always think it from the identity perspective, right? How does being here, and when we talked about, this idea with Lynn, how is being from Cambridge, what does it mean to different people to even say I'm from Cambridge? Do we mean our neighborhood? Do we mean, so to me, just thinking about this from my lens of self-identity and having this opportunity to discuss it with you and explore it in this context was very exciting. So hopefully will come out more of those ideas, but it's really exploring from the identity perspective, both for the city and for us.
So I guess I wanted next to ask if either of you wanted to kick it off with a question for each other. Do either of you have a question that you've been dying to ask as we've been talking? You mentioned earlier wanting to ask more about group identity. Maybe we could start there.
Yeah,
because I'm a historian, I take everything from a historical perspective, so I'm always interested to know in terms of a social psychology perspective, how it is that you look at interpersonal relationships and how that forms identity. And from that perspective, how you see that from sort of your work.
Great. So I think it's actually quite interesting because even now, when you just started, Diana, you said, look around. When you were raising the hands, look around and see. And then when we were looking, right, how many already have formed some groups? Like, oh yes, I see, like you and you and you, you're like a group of people who've lived here for 30 years and more. And you live here for 5. Even just now in this room, I think you already started feeling some in-group and out-group just by this simple question. And I think that illustrates just how easily and quickly we form groups around things that might not be important in the grand scheme of things, but it's because it stems from this natural desire, involved desire to belong, that it's so spontaneous and easy for us to become groups. But what does it mean then when we form a group, right? Then we have this group, then somebody has to be outside of the group, right? And so who is our in-group? And then who becomes our out-group? And then what does it mean, right? So we tend to experience in-group as kind of more heterogeneous. We see more nuances. The out-group becomes more homogeneous. We have this, in-favoritism. And so what, to me, the question is really interesting if we think about it from these implications of forming groups. How do we think about groups? When you say I'm from Cambridge, for example, people who came here for work, do you mean Cambridge? Is it more around your work area? Is it more around the neighborhood you live? Is it more around friends? If you're, if you have kids or else in school, is it more around the school community? Or do we think more inclusively Cambridge overall, right? And I'd be really interested to even think about, maybe as you're thinking to yourself, what impact does it have if you're thinking more locally versus if you're thinking Cambridge as a whole? And how do we create potentially this more inclusive Cambridge community as opposed to maybe more inclusive kind of my neighbor's community? And then we're thinking about it in a more kind of smaller groups, then who is our out group? So when we're thinking about Cambridge, and then maybe that would be a question that I'm setting up for you, right? So is there one Cambridge? Like for example, Harvard, we have this model of like one Harvard, but yet we still have schools that are distinct. So when we think about Cambridge, is there one Cambridge, or is my in-group implies, a certain neighborhood would imply a different in-group, a different out-group, also within Cambridge? So, and I'm actually also very interested to see how, what would be those groups if it's not one inclusive, and then maybe we can think later how we can create a more inclusive Cambridge community, and what would the implications be for that? I think this is like my way of actually asking questions to you.
Well, I take everything from a historical perspective. So I take everything from the perspective of the fact that you're in a very old city. And I think that probably about, I can say this safely as a historian, about every 50 years, Cambridge, Boston area has like this identity crisis. And it starts to like reevaluate what does it mean. And that's good because it means that the city is very, and the region is very like self-reflective, and I think is in a way that other parts of the country might not necessarily have the same relationship with looking at itself. It also means, though, that there's this tendency to forget that you're part of a historical trajectory and that you're in a historical context, and what that entails. So a historical context would be who is being replaced and how that is historically contingent, and why that might be based on the historical processes that exist. So what does zoning in Cambridge look like in 1970s, and how does that then affect the way Cambridge looks in 2018? What did school policy look like in the 1950s, and how does that affect the way schools look like in 2018? What do historically the role that Cambridge has played in terms of immigration on a national and a local scale, and what then how does that then affect, that history affect the way Cambridge looks in 2018? So everything has to be looked at from a historical perspective, and when we look at sort of where is Cambridge from and what does that look like, the fact that it's part of this long historical trajectory, and a trajectory that's in relationship to the areas that surround Cambridge, right? Why, I'm very local, so why, I always joke with everybody when people start talking about like squares in Cambridge. And I grew up around here, and I'm like, what? There's a square? Like, well, that wasn't a square like 20 years ago. That was just a place, right? And the fact that historically, where did that come from? And that's a historical process. You know, there was a decision made 50 years ago that you would create a way in which you made squares, and so that's why a certain place has a reflection. So I would say that there's a historical, everything is historical perspective, and that is to say that as we're having questions about where Cambridge is from in 2018, that the questions are not new, that they've been there and they're usually reevaluated about every 50 years. What is new is the people who are making the decisions, which is all of everybody in the room is probably new. I wasn't here 50 years ago, but the fact that the questions, it's a historical question that you're asking.
So would you bring it back down in time and place for us to? Do you have a particular story in mind, or process or event that you'd like to give us more rich detail about, like maybe 100 years ago? What was asking where is Cambridge from? What did that mean then? Like 100 years ago, when your ancestors were first coming and moving into Magazine Beach, who got to ask that question, and what were the answers to that question 100 years ago?
So during the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Massachusetts was one of 3 states that drew Caribbean migrants and migrants who were not white to the United States. Massachusetts, Florida, and New York were the 3 states to which people of African descent who were immigrants came to, and part of that has to do with the immigration laws. And one of the things that happened was that back in, say, 1915, 1918, there were discussions about what does this mean for the identity of Cambridge as an Anglo-Saxon city? That was the term used by Henry Cabot Lodge and the Lodge family, who were not Cantabrigians, but they were Bostonians, and they had this huge conversation about what that looked like. And then you had these migrants coming, who moved initially to Kendall Square and then eventually to Central Square. And there was talk on should that become part of Boston, because you have this influx of non-white immigrants. And so Cambridge City Council met in the early 19-teens, and thankfully there are people on the City Council who said, no, this is part of Cambridge, we're not gonna zone off this area and make it part of Boston. But that means that then Kendall Square and Cambridge, where was Cambridge in 1915, 1918 to those people? To those people, that would have not been part of Cambridge, right? The conversation would have been that because you have these non-white migrants coming, we need to expel, somehow get rid of this area that is Kendall Square and Central Square. Of course, that didn't happen, but that was the discussion at the time. So that's a context, right? It means that the people in the room who were having those conversations, to them at the time, that was a very real conversation, just like we have real conversations in 2018. And then that's gonna have a huge effect on then how those areas of the city developed. Why is it that Kendall Square, in the scheme of Cambridge, is a recent development in terms of restaurants and that type of thing. I can remember when Kendall Square was like, there was nothing in there, and when they put in the mall, back in the early 90s, and it was like, oh my gosh, there's a mall in Kendall Square, and you had to take the bus out, and it was like this major thing, and what are you doing? There's a whole debate about should there be a mall, because who is that attracting to Cambridge? And that was a real conversation for people in the 90s. So that's to give us a historical perspective on that then shapes the identity of the city that you have. It then shapes the identity of the people who are in the room when you're having the conversation. So when you're having the conversation in 1915, 1918, were Caribbean immigrants and Cape Verdean immigrants in the room? No, generally not. There was one named Emery T. Morris, who was an African-American sealer of weights and measures, who was a black man who was elected to local office. He was in the room, and that's why it was covered in the black press. But most of the time they weren't in the room, right? In the 90s, when there were discussions about the mall, who was in the room, right? And so those are contingent, those would be examples of historically contingent conversations.
So I'm interested to hear about the black press a little bit more, because you were talking, when you refer to in the room, you mean the room of lawmakers and people at the city who are making decisions, but obviously those Caribbean migrants and Cape Verdean migrants are in their own rooms. And what are the conversations they're having about Cambridge? Are they part of Cambridge? How long does that take? What's that story like?
Oh, they would definitely consider themselves part of Cambridge, right? So there's a magazine, our newspaper called The Guardian, that begins publishing in 1901. It's a Boston-based magazine, or a newspaper produced by William Monroe Trotter. It became the kind of leading radical black newspaper in the country for about 10 years. And part of that newspaper was creating a platform through which African American people could talk back to the Jim Crow laws that were going around all over the country. And so there were columns, and people would write in, and they would debate both the governor of Massachusetts, the mayor of Massachusetts, the mayor of Cambridge. They would have these debates over issues of policy. And as a result, it meant that people who were the immigrants definitely would consider themselves part of Cambridge. Whether the way they considered themselves part of Cambridge looked like what native Canterburyans thought was Cambridge was something else. I mean, I know my own family, like most immigrants do, is they migrated a lot between Barbados and Cambridge. We know that 50% of immigrants, including Italians and sort of that first group, migrated back and forth, right? So they migrated back and forth, but they would consider themselves being in Cambridge, right? Even if the powers that be didn't believe that they were part of Cambridge. One of the things that Massachusetts had going for it was that African American people could vote. And so African American people would vote in the 1880s and show up at city council meetings, at state legislative meetings, and even if they weren't allowed to be in there, make sure they were in the room. And so that's how we have the record of them participating and kind of talking back to what Cambridge meant or what Boston meant at the time.
So this is really interesting, because we're getting at the difference between, or the contestation, that's such an academic word, but I'm going to use it, between self-identity and described identity, or institutionalized identity, or and I'm interested to know what your thoughts are about that, because that must be something that you think about a lot. You can, yeah.
Oh, I have a choice. So I think that I was thinking about exactly that same thing in terms of the difference between self-identity and then social identity. So one of the things which we talked about in terms of groups, right? So we derive some of our identities through the membership in certain groups. And what's interesting, right, as I mentioned in the beginning, identities are dynamic. Our identities are dynamic, group identities are dynamic. And what you were suggesting earlier, right, that as Cambridge evolved, and I've seen that people here have been for 30 years, right? So the identity of Cambridge probably has evolved throughout this time. So then how do we identify with this group? What does it mean for our own identity, right? If what it means to be, in Cambridge, being from Cambridge changes, then what does it mean for us to say that? And interestingly enough, so I don't really watch Super Bowl, I have to confess. But I think it's an interesting analogy to draw. Not from the sports perspective, but it's actually quite remarkable. When people think about even sports and the teams they identify with, so done this research, anytime that the team wins, they were doing it in college. So the team would win, and then they would call students up, and they would ask them questions, and students were more likely to use the word we. Like, we won, we did this, or we did that. And then when the team would lose, they would be more likely to say they did this, and they did that. Absolutely. So, I mean, this is not to say anything about Super Bowl. Like I said, I'm not an expert on that at all. But I think it's interesting to think about also, how does identity of Cambridge change? And are we likely to say we? Are we likely to say they? Or are we going to just refine what we mean by we? Like, are we, as you said about squares, like, are we going to say we? Do we mean Cambridge? Do we mean people around Harvard Square? So how does the interact between the social groups and then our self-identities?
But I think what Kerri's story tells is not just the difference between social and individual, but also the political nature of identity. That there's people, there's power in play about who gets to decide. And when you told your story about immigration, you brought that up too, about how identities that need to be hidden and things like that. And so how does that fit into the story that you're telling?
So now you're asking from the perspective of people potentially who are coming in, and the question whether or not they belong, and what does it mean? And of course, even from the identity of concealment perspective, not every identity can be concealed, but to the extent to which from the other perspective, right? You said, are they wanted or not wanted? What happens when you feel like you're not wanted in the environment, right? So if it's very important for you to feel like that you're from Cambridge, but you know that being from Cambridge, you're not just that. You also might have multiple identities which are not necessarily congruent or not valued in that setting. And so then what does happen in that situation, right? So you have multiple options. If you have, when it's not visible, you can conceal. In fact, I think that's what drew me to this research in the first place, because for a while, the conversations have been around identities that are visible and the consequences of having a visible identity in a setting where you're not wanted for that identity. And the implicit assumption was that as long as you can conceal an identity, then you're kind of protected from those consequences. And so I was interested to understand what does it mean for us then to conceal identity for our psychological, cognitive environment. Do we even identify with a place where we have to conceal it? And then we do have to conceal it also. How do we navigate those identities, right? And so as we think about, even what I said before, being Russian Jew is very different. So I actually would be very interested to even think from the perspective, historical perspective, what would it mean for somebody to say I'm from Cambridge with maybe having a racial minority, being ethnic minority, being national minority? Both something you can conceal and something you cannot conceal. What would that identity mean for them to say I'm from Cambridge than to people who have a dominant identity, who have a power dynamic?
I mean, and another way of asking that question, or a corollary question, is like, why did it matter so much that they shouldn't be part of Cambridge? Like,
Yes.
what is that all about? Like, what's so important about Cambridge that you need to, that in 15, 18, they were thinking about how they might be able to change the city boundaries?
I mean, well, historically, this is like the American question, right? Of who belongs, and I mean, particularly New England has a long tradition of this idea of white Anglo-Saxon science, which is a whole other conversation, but it's like this tradition that exists, which is the notion that New England somehow is unique in the rest of the country because it staves off non-Protestantism. And then when Irish Catholics start to come in the 1840s, there's this huge crisis of identity, right? And then when non-white and Southern and Eastern European immigrants start to come in the late 19th, early 20th century, there's then this need to reevaluate and reinvigorate that. But definitely that's an American project. I think what differentiates Cambridge and this area of Greater Boston is the notion that somehow it's immune to that because it's a university city, and that somehow because people are educated, they're less likely to have those Anglo-Saxon views. And we know that Anglo-Saxon science is invented at the Lawrence Scientific School at Harvard. So it's not something that is coming out of uneducated people. It's coming out of people who are educated racial scientists who would be in the room and say, this is why we need to have these boundaries, because they're coming in and they're ruining our Anglo-Saxon heritage. So I think that's a very powerful thing. And that's a very American story, but it's also a very sort of unique in the sense that Greater Boston in particular, so it's not just Cambridge, but Greater Boston in particular has a tendency to have this idea that somehow it's immune from these racial proclivities because it is more enlightened, even though enlightenment can often create the very prejudices that then lead to policy.
So we're reaching the close of our conversation, which feels like just the beginning of our conversation, which is great because it's the beginning of the year. And I wanted to ask you guys kind of a pair of questions, one that we had planned in advance and one that I'm thinking of now as we're talking.
Don't do it to us.
I know. Just answer how you will. So the question that's coming out of this conversation that we're having is, like, is it important that people who live in Cambridge feel that they are from Cambridge? From each of your perspectives, is that something that is important and should be strived for? And what are the stakes of that? And then the second half of that question might be related, is what advice do you have as educators, as thinkers, as people in the world? What advice do you have for us as we embark on our year of thinking about this question, where is Cambridge from, for us to think about, for us to try to not think about, for us to, for us to be aware of? So I'm going to, does one of you want to field that pair of questions first? Yeah, you want to go?
Definitely. So the first question about whether it's important. So first, again, I'm going to come back to the beginning. How quickly people raise hands when you asked, "Am I from Cambridge?" Is it important for you to feel from Cambridge? I think the question is more: is it important for you to belong? If you live in Cambridge, right, and you're hesitant to say I'm from Cambridge, especially if you've spent here so much time, what does it mean if you're reluctant to say that you're from Cambridge? And I think it's less about Cambridge and more around the community. And when you say, I can easily say I'm from here, that means that there's a sense of belonging. And I think reframing it in that sense, is it important to belong? I mean, I think the answer becomes obvious. Yes, right, it is important to belong. And I think then connecting to the second in terms of the takeaways, right? So then how can we create this community of belonging? And social psychological perspective around identity, in the city having identity, right? And the town having identity. Just the same way as an individual, right? As I said before, individual is influenced by the surroundings and by the context, the same way that the city can be influenced by the surrounding and the context. And especially now, in the current environment, right, where I think the identity of the city will become even more salient in the kind of outside environment. Like, what does it mean for us to be from Cambridge? What does it mean to be Cambridge? And I think having this kind of more inclusive identity, because we have the world around, might then lead us to be more inclusive even within Cambridge, so that more people feel like they belong across, we just talk about across different groups, and across different intersectional identities, that they all feel kind of a part of Cambridge, and creating this more inclusive environment because of the context.
I want to ask a follow-up question to that, which is just the word or the idea of a superordinate identity. So sounds like a football team and allegiance to a sports team is an example of a kind of superordinate identity. Pats fans is one big identity, and that you can share that with people who you don't share a bunch of other things with, but you all share that big one. Do you have any? Are there any specific findings that you can point to about what makes and structures a successful and enduring superordinate identity across a very diverse group of people?
Yes, and definitely. And I think if you can even go even broader, right, you can think about it as Patriots fans or even sports fans, right? So I think you can make it as inclusive as you want to go, kind of how broadly we're defining sports. And I think one of the key areas is common goal. I mean, we also talk about common enemy, but I think the more productive way, nothing unites people, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of. But I think I would like to go maybe in a different direction a little bit. Instead of finding common enemy, I think finding common goal. So kind of more positive. I think nothing unites people more than having around the values that are shared in pursuit of that common goal. I think would be one way to strive to achieve that one common identity in the most productive and constructive way.
And how do you articulate that shared identity, those shared values? Like, is that big signs everywhere, or is that lots of little conversations, or how does that happen?
I think we're doing right now. So I think through conversations. And I think the conversations are much more impactful when they're more intimate and then they kind of spread. I mean, we can think about it kind of from within to without and the other way around. But I mean, being biased, I think this is already a great start. And hopefully, as you continue communicating throughout, having those conversations and then having them spread out so you can go out and have conversations. And then you can kind of see, it's almost like framing and having framing effect, right? What are our values? Can we go and can we spread it around? Can we find those commonalities? Can we all work toward common goals? And I think that rather than kind of being imposed upon us, really find it from within would be my advice.
So Kerri, to you, same questions. Do we need to all feel like we're from Cambridge? Is that important? If so, or if not, why? And then advice.
I think that it's important for people to believe, as you were saying, which I like, is believe that they're part of something greater than themselves. And if that means that you believe if you live in Cambridge, or whether you just moved here or you've been here for 50 years, that you're part of something greater with the trajectory, the historical trajectory of the city, I think that's very valuable. Because then it makes the decisions that are made, the policies that are made that are going to be there 50, 60 years down the line are going to be much more consequential to you if you think of it as you're just part of this trajectory of what that history means. So I think that's the way to approach being from a place without getting sort of nationalistic or that dangerous line. But I would say that the kind of where the takeaway where you go, I think continuing to have the conversation, I think continuing to acknowledge who is in the room and who is not. and make an effort to have as the wonderful diversity that is Cambridge, that when you have meetings, the people who are actually part of that diversity are there. That can often be hard to do, but that's because people are people and people are hard to deal with, right? But, you know, suck it up and do it, right? Yeah, you know, you can get people in the room by trying to deal with personalities, but get as many people as you can in the room, and then that's how you end up making the hard decisions. But overall, again, if you're part of this long trajectory, realizing that people have done it before, so you can do it now. And you can kind of move it forward, right? The people who were in the room in 1918 who were trying to make the wrong decision, they didn't make the wrong decision, right? To cut off Kendall Square and Central Square because people were in the room, right? Hard conversation to have, but then that means you're part of the trajectory moving forward, and then you have to make decisions. You make decisions and you make sure people are in the room, and it will be trying, but then you move forward. So acknowledging that you're part of that historical trajectory.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. What I'm hearing from you is the idea of like the well-being aspects of belonging. And from you, I'm hearing about the engagement aspects of belonging, or that belonging is a precursor for successful advocacy, activism, engagement, because if you don't feel like you belong, or at least ought to be acknowledged to belong, then the stakes aren't there for you to participate. Is that what you're saying a little bit?
Yeah, and I think that this is the great conundrum of democracy, right? It's hard to do.
Hey, we got there, everybody.
Yes, yeah, no, I mean, but I think that's like politically, historically, that's what people say, is that you have to have, if you really want a functioning decisions to be made, you have to get as many people into the room as possible. It's not going to be easy. It never is easy. It can be uncomfortable, but you have to do it. And particularly if you're in a place like here, you have a long history of people who have done it, right? And so you're just in a moment where you have to figure out in your moment how you do it. But, you know, it's been done before.
Is there any, I think historians are really important for pointing us towards like past models of success, you know, people that we can look towards. Is there anyone in your research or in your life history that you could point to that is a really good example of someone who was doing that work in the past?
Not specific to Cambridge, but I would say there's a woman named Ruth Batson, who was an activist in Boston in terms of the segregated public schools in the 50s and 60s, and trying to get the city of Boston to acknowledge that they had segregated public schools. That's all she wanted them to do, so that then they could get the funding, so then they could make the solution. And nobody wanted to acknowledge that the schools were segregated, right? Again, that Boston thing where we don't want to admit that we're the rest of the country, right? And so Ruth Batson, you know, making sure that you had these meetings and you made people show up and you made people acknowledge that this is what happened. So I think that's like, you know, democracy in action. Did people get up and leave the room and never talk to each other and get mad? Yes. Did people get upset and take things personally? Yes. But you end up trying to move as much as you can forward where mistakes made historically, of course. But then you're moving it forward, and you're part of having that democratic engagement that can be ugly, but otherwise, you know, why would you? You should be engaging in a democratic way.
Is there anything I missed before we turn it over to Q&A? Anything that you guys want to add that you feel like is missing before the audience gets a chance to say what they think's missing?
No, I think that was really well.
Yes.
Great, cool. So,
And by the way, Ruth Batson herself, a great public historian, one of the guiding lights behind the Boston African American Meeting House, right? Like the first director?
She was one of the founders. Yep.
One of the founders, yeah. Questions?
We've been speaking about identity from us, but I'm wondering about how we're identified outside of the community. I mean, if you tell somebody you're from Cambridge, chances are they know a little bit. They know Harvard. Oh, that's the People's Republic. You know, that kind of view of what Cambridge is. And I'm just, you know, we're a very historic city, a lot more history. I think, 6 presidents went to school here. And so there's a little bit special about Cambridge. And I'm just wondering if you have comments about how we're viewed from the outside, and do we get defensive about that? Are we prideful about that? So maybe you could comment on that.
And yes, thank you. I think this is exactly a great question to ask in terms of when we are asked, right? We said, you know, where we're from. Do we, you know, what do we say? And I think it's even more important, for example, when we step outside of the community. So, and I'm going to come back to this, but the idea, for example, when I've lived in the United States, but I'm from Russia, but then let's say I go to Europe, and somebody in Europe in the third place asks me where I'm from. Do I say I'm from Russia, or do I say I'm from the United States? And a lot of it is also what information am I communicating to people, and that assumes kind of their own perceptions of what it means to be from Cambridge, for example. And I was actually thinking a lot about that. You mentioned, Harvard. What would it be like, right, if Harvard was not founded here? Right? Because a lot of what we're known for, and why we have this, is because Harvard University is located here, so people know about it. So when you say I'm from Cambridge to outside people, what associations do you evoke? And I think it goes a little bit back to what I said earlier about the teams, right? When you say we and versus AI, kind of it's really dual relationship. When you say I'm from Cambridge, you need to understand what they mean, and then are you willing to say that you're part of that, right? And I think that view shapes it. So why do we feel it goes both ways. Why do you feel so strongly about Cambridge identity, so that you can go ahead and confidently say to others, I'm from Cambridge, and be proud of that? In the same way, right, what does it mean to people to hear that you're from Cambridge? And I actually am interested to hear in terms of Harvard's relationship to that, right? How much it played a role, and what if it were founded somewhere else? Would we feel the same way from Cambridge?
I just think from a historical perspective, I don't think you could have Cambridge without the universities. I think that's the strength, the biggest strength of the city, is having the universities that are in it. And the strength of that is that then you have a lot of resources that I don't even think people realize until you leave. So I was one of those people who grew up here and was like, I'm never going back to Massachusetts, and then I somehow ended up back here and becoming an academic. So the joke was on me, but I mean, one of the things that happens is that there's a lot of resources here, which makes it so that things can be done that I don't think people realize can be done, given that you have that capital of the universities in one place. I think to answer your question, sort of how historically people view the outside, it's a strength in that I know that my family, who is from Barbados, they chose to come to Cambridge, right? So they arrived in Boston and they made the decision to move to Cambridge because of the schools and because they were from Barbados and they valued education, and they knew that at the time the Cambridge public schools were less segregated than the Boston public schools. And then they urged their friends from Barbados and Jamaica and Trinidad to come to Cambridge because at the time, the 19-teens and 1920s, it was less segregated than Boston. So that's a very powerful thing, right? Historically, that Cambridge can use. Educational institutions. Are they perfect? No, but that's a draw, right? That's historically what the place is known for. And you can use that as to build on your strengths, right? And to build on sort of building bridges into the future.
I just want to say also that what I'm hearing from you and from them is the idea that talking about identity is relational. And so, and you used, I don't remember if you used the word boundaries, but you did use the word outside, and we haven't really talked much about, I guess the Kendall Square example is a very physical example, but the idea of you don't have an in-group without an out-group, and you don't have shared identity without difference. And so when you're talking with someone who's not from Cambridge, saying you're from Cambridge is a way of, it's a way of engaging that relational aspect of identity, and I think that that's a really good thing to bring up, and maybe something for us to talk about over the course of the year as we have more people in the room maybe who haven't been in Cambridge as long, for example, or we talk to people who have come to Cambridge by choice or by chance and what that dynamic is like. And I'm hoping also we'll be able to think about things like the relationship between Cambridge and Boston. So, okay, we have another question in the audience.
A parallel, perhaps. Newport, Rhode Island, I lived there for 10 years and had interesting conversations about this pre-revolutionary community that went back to 1642 rather than 1630, but with a wide array of people coming. Very early black community, very early Sephardic Jewish community, and a history of people coming and going over a very long period of time. And I was fascinated to hear people characterized as the wash ashores. And I'd never heard that term, but I said, what does that mean? And the wash ashores are the people who wash ashore, literally, and then they wash away. They don't stay. So I'd be interested in any observations you have about what makes people wash ashores and washaways in Cambridge.
The idea of whether people stay, I think, is very important, both for how these groups are crafted and how political capital moves and all this stuff. I'm going to hand it to you.
Well, historically, I think this, from a historical perspective, it's a very relevant question. It's all the key historically has been in housing, right? And economic opportunity. So why would somebody become a wash ashore and choose to leave? It often has to do with how they see their economic prospects in an area. So I know that just having taught in this area for a long time, first at UMass and then at Tufts, is seeing a lot of students who would want to stay in this area because they like it here and it's too expensive. And so literally at 22 they can't afford to stay, and so that's when they leave and they come back. A lot of my friends now who are starting to have kids and were raised here, the same thing happened, right? They were raised here, they can no longer afford to live here, so they go away and pursue their careers, and then they come back like in their, I'm not going to age myself, but like 30s, 40s, and they, when they can afford to move here. So I think that's an aspect of that whole term of wash ashore is people, that there's a huge segment of people who I know anecdotally, but just historically, if you look at the trajectory of people who would stay, right? But if you're 22, 23, can't afford to stay, want to have a certain economic prospect, you leave and then you come back afterwards. I mean, most of the people I work with at Tufts who are academics went to school in this area, either Harvard, MIT, or wherever, left, got their degree, and then had to come back, and now they want to raise their children here, right? Because this is where they were raised, and they see the value of it, but they couldn't afford to do so until they left. So I think that's a historical, it's an economic question, but it's, that's a historical trajectory that particularly Boston and Cambridge has had. Du Bois always said he wanted to remain in this area, couldn't afford to stay, right? And taught at Atlanta, and then came back as Du Bois and had houses what he stayed in when he came. But I mean, that's a part of the brain drain when you're talking about that is that aspect of it.
Yes, I think also just a compliment in terms of the perspectives for people who actually stay here, right? What does it mean to have a certain group of people who are transient, right? So I've noticed that people here stay a long time, and then you have another group, perhaps per college, and they just kind of come in, and they go through college, and then they leave. I mean, maybe to come back, maybe not, but you have this transient group, and the question is also in terms of when we talk about in-groups and out-groups. I mean, do you even think about it? I mean, maybe that's posing the question back to the audience to think about. What does it mean? Do you feel this identity is highlighted? Like, I am here, I'm a permanent resident, kind of Cambridge, versus the other group. And is your identification stronger or not with people who just come here for college? And what does it mean, to be part of Cambridge for a certain period of time, even if it's formative years? And so I think it's interesting to think about how we think about in-group and out-group in terms of our, commitment to this place.
And just leaving aside the wash ashore idea, but the idea of staying and going, I mean, historically, homeownership has been incentivized, and so independent of the social dynamics of a university town, owners versus renters is a dynamic that exists in many cities, and especially in a city like ours, where many of those renters are people who have short-term employment prospects in a place through an institution. But also like I said, the historic incentives for homeownership making that dynamic be very strong. I think that's another aspect of that idea of transience versus stability and how that's perceived and how that then gets handed down and moves around. Does anyone else have a question?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Vince Dixon. I used to live in this mid-Cambridge neighborhood. And there's two fragments here that you might comment on. One is the sense of Cambridge being a greater Cambridge. Born at Mount Auburn Hospital, grew up in Alston, but even in my early teens, I was playing with young people over here. My parents knew people, so Alston still, in some ways, is part of a greater Cambridge. when it came time to move, I actually moved into physical Cambridge with people I knew and area I knew. That's an interesting part of Cambridge because it's much larger than the physical location of where people have lived in Cambridge per se. The other part, which is often not really touched on, is there was a very important Slavic community here. There were Polish National, Polish Roman Catholic, Lithuanian. It's curious, the Ukrainian Center at Harvard wound up here. And many of us of Slavic background thought of ourselves as Slavic, not necessarily white or people of color, but something very different, and often criticized for being more cosmopolitan or European. In more recent years, John Paul II, of Jewish and Catholic background, kind of redeemed ourselves as part of the Western world. I'm just sort of curious what your thoughts are in terms of that evolution, in terms of that, because part of this is also a bridge back to Europe where the American experience has informed Europe in recent years.
I also want to maybe expand that idea to just the idea of immigrants having pan-regional identities, right? And how being Lithuanian versus being Ukrainian suddenly becomes Slavic when you're all together as immigrants. And so, does one of you want to take that? Do you want to take it?
I think I was going to say very little. Okay. I think most of the, I do think that what you just mentioned, I'm going to build on that and I'm going to pass it along because I think you have more perspective of historical. But I think goes back to the in-group and out-group all of a sudden, right? So when you're within, say, Lithuania, like, the differences between Lithuanians become much more pronounced. But when you're in a different group, all of a sudden you are immigrants. You are maybe, Europeans, maybe, but it becomes a much more it becomes perceived to be much more homogeneous group. And then it's interesting to think of the implications for that, right? If you don't see those individual differences, you just kind of lumped in one group. It could be positive, like you can be thinking about it from having, what you talked about before, kind of this super or inclusive identity. On the other hand, you can also, on the other hand, it also de-individualizes people, right? And it kind of overlooks their differences, which are very important. It could be very culturally rich. So I think it depends on how you approach it from there.
A good question. I mean, historically, we know that America, based on sort of how they're conceptualizing race at the moment, tends to collapse ethnicity and create sort of its own thing. So in terms of, particularly in terms of Cambridge and greater Cambridge, Boston, it's what you're talking about sort of sounds very similar to how did Trinidadians or Bajans or Jamaicans become black, right? To them, they would have considered them, I know I have members of my family who I love dearly who were in Barbados would say, but I'm black, but I would not consider myself African American, right? Then you come to Cambridge and you are, this area and you are considered African American and they embrace that identity. But it's the same, historically that has been the case of collapsing the ethnic flavors that exist in a group of people in exchange for the binary that America is used to, which is like you're either white or you're a black person. And it's really very recently, and I say very recently, as in 2000 when the census first allowed people to check off, that you were mixed race. So that's how recent it is that America has started to just conceptualize what that actually means.
Let's see, I just wanted to sort of almost pick up on that, this idea of how people identify themselves versus how other people see us. And this idea of wash ashore sounds very derogatory to me. It sounds like the implication is that people sort of washed up, they showed up, as opposed to perhaps being born and bred in an area. So I think what's interesting also, again, is to look at how we define ourselves and others define us, and how they see us through their lens.
So this actually is so timely because, as I mentioned, this course and self-knowledge. So actually for this Thursday, I'll be teaching it, students have been asked to rate themselves in terms of how the descriptors they came up with themselves, how well they describe them, and then pass it along to people around them and see how well they think they describe them. And I think that is really interesting, right, of how do we even conceptualize ourselves and how we define us. I don't think it's a binary question because a lot of times how we define ourselves is drawn on how we think others perceive us. And it could be either consistent or inconsistent, but whatever reaction we have, I think the dichotomy itself is not there. It's really interchangeable. And sometimes we can strive so people can see us consistently, which could also mean even be negative as long as it's consistently, right? And sometimes we do draw inferences about ourselves based on how other people see us. So I think that it kind of goes back almost to this question on Cambridge too, right? And how people outside perceive Cambridge. It's a very dynamic relationship that kind of has bi-causal relationship.
And just to the historical perspective, the term wash ashore, we know that many people who were defined as that embraced that identity because they saw it, particularly in a certain historical perspective. You're talking about the late 19th, early 20th century, that they were like cosmopolitan. And so even though 2018, we might find that offensive, again, this is part of historical trajectory. To get to your comment, there was actually a segment in something called the Boston Advocate that was a black newspaper published in Boston that was celebrating black wash-ashores because they considered themselves as having an identity where they could choose to go. Where they could choose to they could choose to go, right, where black people couldn't often choose where they went. So they'd embrace this identity.
In Newport, wash ashore was a term that was used largely for the summer people.
Yes.
That started coming from the south to actually to escape disease, but they were the white summer people.
Yes.
They weren't black.
And they weren't black. No, exactly. So to the point is sort of historically.
And the very diverse community.
Yes.
In Newport that coined the term.
Yes. Yes, but the point being that that's historically contingent. So, right, Newport, you're using it a certain way in the 19th century. By 1900, 1910, black people in Boston are using it in a certain way, not necessarily derogatorily. By the 1940s, my grandfather's family, who was from Virginia, who went to the Navy Yard in Boston, they embraced the term wash ashore because it meant that they could choose where to go. They could escape Jim Crow, right? And so they washed ashore in a new place, and they redefined themselves. So that's important when sort of the point of having a historical perspective on what terms and identity means. It's historically contingent for many groups of people.
So that was our last question, right? So
I'm looking for
Okay, I wanted to summarize a little bit or reiterate something that I've been hearing, which is that another thing that is possible, then you've been talking about dynamic identities and the idea that something that might be given or might be perceived as derogatory can be co-opted or reimagined as something oppositional or political or positive, all of these things. So like the ways that like both identity words, but also just even some of these questions about who's in and who's out. If you're out, then there's ways that people in history and in psychology imagine turning being on the outside into a positive, or claiming being on an outside, or demanding to be on the inside from the perspective of being, like, it's a really interesting thing. And so but this is something to be aware of, is the idea that like how are these identities being used and recaptured? There's a word that I'm missing here, but like reinvented or something like that. Okay. Great, cool.
So, I have a question. I'm Phil Wellens. It's been fascinating to listen to this for lots of reasons, but one of them is it reminded me that groups have stories about themselves, which I think of as myths often. So there's a part of a myth that's just accurate, and there are parts of myths that are just that. They're imaginary. They're not really true. One of the myths we've got that just came up very briefly was the People's Republic. So what does that mean exactly? It means we're quite liberal, right? Well, people's republics weren't exactly liberal. They were quite authoritarian. So I started wondering what our other myths are about ourselves, and what are the accurate parts of those myths, and what are the ones that are not so much. And I wanted to raise that as a question for the speakers and for anybody else who wants to pick it up.
I'm with you. I think that that's the most interesting and exciting part of all of this, and hopefully the most interesting and exciting part of this whole year. And I'm wondering, you're nodding your head, so maybe do you have some myths of collective identity that you'd like to share, or a particular story of one?
I think that I think this myth that, as I was alluding to earlier before, that because we have so much mental capital and intellectual capital in Cambridge, that it's somehow immune from being part of the collective American tale that Americans tell about themselves in terms of race and policy. So that this notion that Cambridge is a liberal and progressive place, comparative to when I lived in Cleveland, Ohio, yes. Did my mother make the decision to not raise her 3 black daughters in Cambridge? Absolutely. In the 70s and 80s, that was a decision. Because it was not a liberal place to raise 3 little black girls in the 70s and 80s. So I would say that that's one of the stories we tell ourselves about the region, even though comparatively, in the whole scheme of things, does Cambridge have a particular contribution to the progressive tradition? Yes. Does the progressive tradition also have a big contribution to American racism and sexism? Yes. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, right? And being able to understand that those two things go hand in hand from a historical perspective, right?
I think that's a great question. I think it ties together the last 2 questions very well in terms of kind of the perceptions and the myth. And I think it's what I'd like to point out, even this idea about accuracy when it comes to identity is often the myth itself, right? And we are constantly, when people are like, why do we get to want to know the identity of the city or the identity of ourselves, right? If people think we want to be accurate. What does it even mean, right, to be progressive state, right? Can you really reach this accuracy? I think that's a huge myth in its own right. And I think recognizing that it's a perception, and depending on whom we compare it to, and be it time-wise in the history, in the context, or even in the current environment, depending on whom and what we reference, could mean very different things to different people. So I think just understanding the myth around the accuracy perspective is important.
Yeah, if I were to answer my own question about what advice I would give, I would say listening for these stories of collective identity and thinking about accuracy and thinking about where and when accuracy matters, what those stories are doing, how they're operative, give them names. Like, oh, here I'm hearing the myth of the People's Republic. Oh, here I'm hearing the myth of George Washington. Oh, here I'm hearing the myth of the expansion of the Charles River, right? Like, what are these tales? Often they come from origin stories. Often they come from a sense that that we can excavate shared identity from going back to some kind of beginning, and we can invent those shared beginnings as much as we can find them. And I think often the work of historians is to think about how those stories are operating and what the actual details of those stories are. How can they become more complex? Myths are one-dimensional. Mythic characters are only symbols, right? Real flesh and blood people are complex and they're difficult, like you said. And so how can a historian's work is to breathe flesh and blood into those myths and give them complexity and nuance, and to really see how they're operating and figure out how we can make them better, and also how that complexity can give us more opportunities for complexity in our own lives and interactions with other people. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to think about that, because I think that that's really great. Are we good? Okay, cool. Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you, guys. This has been really awesome.
So, wasn't that wonderful? What a great way to start the year. Thought-provoking, interesting. Kerri and Alexandra, thank you very much. Diana, wonderful job. And Marika, are you still here? There you are. Thank you for coming tonight. We pulled her off of her maternity leave to show up, and we really appreciate that. And we're delighted to have you coming back pretty soon. We've been missing you. So for those who don't know, my name is Todd Beatty. I'm the current president of the Cambridge Historical Society Governing Council. A few years ago, after completing, with the help of many of you, the restoration of the Hooper Lee Nichols House, the council and I embarked on our quest to first professionalize and then expand the scope of the Society's mission, sort of like into what you've heard tonight. And I'm delighted to report that we're well on our way. This is our third year of doing this. What we've been aiming to achieve is to publicly discuss how we can use our knowledge of the past to reflect upon our present-day lives so that we're guided to and can imagine a future Cambridge that's even better than it is today. And we believe the Society is uniquely positioned to foster those conversations in which people come together to listen and learn from each other in a safe and welcoming environment. And I think tonight was exactly that. In 2017, we presented more than 20 events throughout the city, history cafes, walking tours, and even some tours of the Hooper Lee Nichols House for elementary school students. We've been very gratified by the attendance at these events, but what I like the most is we're taking history out into the community. Our venues can sometimes be cozy, and sometimes they're boisterous and noisy, but we always have fun, and we always seek to inspire. This past year, the Society conducted more outreach than ever before with a robust social media presence, and thanks to the funding from the Cambridge Savings Bank, a citywide promotional mailing. In 2018, it's important that we continue to build on this momentum. If you attended last year's annual meeting, you might recall that I displayed a chart of our financial goals as they related to our aspirational strategic plan. Unfortunately, our income still lags behind the line on the chart that projects our success into the future. We need your financial support to realize our vision. Though the entire council continues to be pleased with the increase in Historical Society membership, dues alone will not sustain us or allow the Society to grow its programming and impact our community the way we hope to. We need more individuals and local businesses to contribute to our annual fund and invest in the Society's future. We are going places, but we can't get there without your help. We want everyone to know more about the history of our fair city and participate in our bright future. Thank you so much for attending tonight and for your ongoing support. And I will continue on with introducing Helly Meltzner, who will tell us a little bit about her job as our curator, and then we'll elect some new council members and make some changes to the bylaws, and we'll be done. So Helly, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Critical in the management of our collections of objects and our archives are first Maggie Hoffman. Say hello. Our archivist, who's doing a great job with very little time. Next, the Collections Committee is, in current parlance, awesome. I say this because I'm actually in awe of their knowledge, professionalism, and generosity of commitment. Here's a quote from our former archivist I want to read. "The role of stored collections in any organizations may seem extraneous, since the materials tend to be behind closed doors and generally do not directly raise money. Collecting for collecting's sake is not a reason to maintain cultural heritage. Historic objects and collections tell the story of how a place, a people, a culture came to be a certain way." I won't read our mission statement, but it includes a few words I want to emphasize: maintain, preserve, and promote a better understanding of history. For preserve, we have approximately 80 manuscript collections totaling about 320 linear feet, now reduced a bit, 200 which is a good thing, 200 books, 2,000 digital images, and 367 objects, not counting our institutional records. That is a great deal to preserve. But our old house cannot preserve these resources with adequate climate control to industry standards. This represents a serious challenge to the Collections Committee, which has been addressing them. Maintain. We have steadily been gaining intellectual control of our collections, meaning inventorying, processing, cataloging them, and making sure we know where they are. But it has been estimated that with twice the staff hours we now have, it will take 10 years to bring them up to professional standards, without the addition of any more materials. Here is another significant challenge and the reason we are not currently accepting new donations. Promote a better understanding of our history. In 2017, the archive received a total of 173 reference requests and was visited by 30 researchers. Our archivist taught a Harvard class. We have continued updating our website, and the website of the new consortium of the Cambridge Historical Society, the Historical Commission, and the Cambridge Public Library is up and running. In sum, this has been a year of great progress and facing great challenges. But we know the value of our collections to the local community and the world beyond it, and we are working to meet those challenges as best we can. We need a long-term plan and the financial resources to make it possible. I invite you all to explore the extraordinary riches of the archives and see for yourselves its wonderful, quirky potential. Thanks.
We'll see. Hi, I'm Doug Brown. I'm the secretary of the Historical Society, and we just have 3 bits to take care of before we adjourn. But before I get to that, the first thing I wanted to do is refer you to your programs briefly, and I wanted to give a special thanks to departing members of the council. So those are Charlie Allen, Pam Baldwin, and Jan Ferrara. Thank you very much for your service, and we hope you will keep us in your thoughts. The other thing I wanted to point out is that Greg Bowe is stepping down as treasurer. He's going to remain on the board, but we'll have a replacement for him as treasurer, and I want to thank him as well. If you look on page 2, there's a proposed slate of officers, and I won't read everybody off, but my job is to basically get you to vote on those. Oh, Todd's coming up.
You do that. Let's see if I can find them.
Okay. And we'll keep this pretty simple. I'm going to move that we approve the proposed slate of officers and ask if anybody will second that. Second. We have a second, and all in favor say aye. Aye. And all opposed say no. And the ayes have it. Now we have, that's it. That'll do it, if you can bring that up.
Yeah.
How do I get it to show up on the screen? Oh, say resume.
I don't know why. That's weird. Okay. Maybe I have to shut the
Oh, could be. Just have. While we're working on that, you can flip to the back page, and we have some new counselors that are joining us in the coming year. Counselors serve for a 3-year term, and removal of privacy screens is vandalism.
I don't know. I don't know.
If you look in your programs, you'll actually find a handout that lists more information about the new counselors who are joining us. My apologies to Anand. I was late in getting my request for a bio to him, so his bio is very short, but I do have that, and we will be posting those on the website.
Sorry.
It's all right. I'll just move ahead. New members of the council include Matt Brelis. Matt's here. Matt is the Director of Public Affairs for the Massachusetts Port Authority. Amy Devens, who is an archivist, who is sitting with me. Anand Master, who is a graduate research assistant at UMass Boston, and also joining us as a new treasurer. Not sure if Anand's here or not.
No.
He may not have made it. Kyle Sheffield, an architect with LDA Architecture in Cambridge, and Ken Taylor, Taylor and Partners Architects as well, and Ken is here in the back. Don't have any of that up on the screen yet, so I will just go ahead and move ahead and move that we approve the slate of new counselors. And we have a second, and all in favor say aye. Aye. And those opposed say no. And the ayes have it as well. The third piece is not in your program, and it is just some minor updates to the bylaws. Sorry, we passed along our bylaws to board member Constantine Alexander, and he reviewed it to make sure that we were in keeping with sort of modern standards. And there are a few things that we have had to adjust. Give me 1 minute and I will see what I can find here. Yeah, exactly. It would be nice. Oh, wait, hang on. It would be nice to get this going. Maybe I can just read it off. All right, well, technical difficulties. So there's 6 changes that we need to make. The first one is that previously the council was a 19-member council, 8 officers and 11 councilors. And because the number of councilors who turn over every 3 years, that needs to be a multiple of 3 to make the math work. And so we have to adjust the number of councilors from 19 to 20. So that's the first change to the bylaws. Hello? Yeah. Along with that, we have to adjust the way in which the terms are written. Right now, we say that there's 8 councilors that every 3 years, 2 of them are elected, and that math doesn't work. So we have to change that to 12 and 4. The other piece is around a quorum, and previously the way we did a quorum was you had to have 7 council members present. It's preferred to actually have it be 1/3 of the councilors, such that if the number of councilors ever declined, we could still hold a quorum and wouldn't necessarily need 7. As it is, under the current rules, a quorum will still be 7. So it's really just the way it's written for future eventualities, if so come. The other is around voting by proxy. So previously we said that you couldn't vote by proxy. It's more common that councilors can't vote by proxy. They have to vote in person. But when we have a meeting of the membership, like the annual meeting, they could theoretically vote in proxy. So we adjusted that to be in keeping. When you vote for stock, when you vote in the stock market, you basically vote by proxy. The last thing is around some language. We said that the committees shall ensure that everything is properly audited, and our lawyer advises us to say that we'll use all reasonable efforts to assure that everything is properly audited. And then the last piece is around the language around dissolution, and basically we added a line that says if and when we ever were to be dissolved under the 501c3 regulations, that money could be passed to another organization as long as their mission is consistent with what we have set forth in our mission. So those are the 6 changes. I won't actually show the text for you, but I will ask that we go ahead, and I propose that we approve the bylaw changes, and I need a second. Second. All right. All in favor say aye. Aye. And those opposed say no. And the ayes have it. Do you want to adjourn the meeting, or should I?
So just some quick thank yous before we head out in the hall and have some more fun. Lynn, thank you very much for putting together the program. And Rosemary, is she still here or is she outside? Rosemary Praveet for arranging and coordinating tonight's event. To our wonderful interns and volunteers who are here tonight and throughout the day and through the weeks. And to Capital One Cafe, who's been a great supporter of ours since they've arrived in Harvard Square. And they provided the drinks and the food, which was brought to us by Jules Catering. So thank you all for coming tonight, and we hope to see you in April, but hopefully maybe before then. So thanks for coming. And we're going to do the photograph. Right.